The story begins with silence, not from peace but from absence. The Euphrates, once the lifeline of Syrian fields, now trickles in fragmented channels, its bed cracked and exposed under a merciless sun. Villages that once echoed with the hum of irrigation pumps and the cries of harvest laborers now stand in muted suspension, their people staring at dust that refuses to yield grain. Damascus appeals to international donors, but sanctions limit direct transfers. Aid agencies warn of famine but are constrained by access as convoys face checkpoints and contested zones. Turkey, already hosting millions of Syrian refugees, fears another wave driven not by bombs but by empty fields. European capitals, preoccupied with their own energy crises and political debates over migration, brace for renewed inflows if rural Syria collapses further. Meanwhile, Russia, an ally of Damascus, uses food corridors as bargaining chips in broader negotiations with the West, tying humanitarian relief to strategic concessions. Hunger thus becomes entangled in geopolitics, every truckload of flour negotiated like a ceasefire, every bag of grain a pawn in international chess. The conclusion remains open-ended because this crisis does not close with a decisive event. Unlike battles, drought does not announce victory or defeat. It lingers season after season, grinding resilience down to desperation. The question is not whether Syria will suffer famine, millions already do, but how far the chain reaction will spread. Will it remain a rural tragedy, or will it ignite urban unrest in Damascus and Aleppo? Will it destabilize neighbors through refugee flows and market disruptions? Or will it become one node in a broader global pattern where climate extremes compound wars and make hunger the silent weapon of the 21st century? The silence that began this story still hangs over the Euphrates Valley. But it is not empty. It is filled with the weight of an unfolding catastrophe that no ceasefire can end. The war scarred Syria's cities with bombs and blockades, but what unfolds now is slower, less visible, yet no less deadly. A famine born from drought, fed by climate extremes, and sharpened by political fragility. It is a crisis that threatens to outlast battles, lingering like a shadow over the nation's fractured future. The event description is stark. Over the past decade, Syria's rainfall has collapsed to record lows, while temperatures surge above long-term averages. Entire cropping cycles vanish in a single season. Farmers in Raqqa, Aleppo, and Hasakah abandon their lands, forced into migration toward already overburdened towns. Livestock herds, once wealth in motion, collapse as pasture dries to brittle stalks. The United Nations counts millions at risk of acute hunger, while aid corridors remain thin, vulnerable to blockades, sanctions, or the shifting tides of warlord control. In rural Syria, the battlefield is no longer only about airstrikes or artillery. It is a contest between soil and sun, water and wind. When rivers recede, hunger advances. Behind this landscape lies systemic vulnerability. Syria's agricultural system was fragile long before the drought. The Ba'athist state once sought self-sufficiency in wheat, pumping Euphrates waters through vast irrigation projects. But decades of over-extraction, poor water governance, and war damage left infrastructure broken. Diesel shortages halted pumps, sanctions restricted fertilizer imports, and the collapse of rural credit chains stripped farmers of resilience. The climate shock did not fall on a neutral ground. It landed on a brittle structure already fractured by war. This is why the drought translates into famine. A fragile state cannot buffer ecological extreme, and when institutions are hollowed, nature's variability becomes a weapon as sharp as artillery. The vulnerability is not only agricultural, but systemic, intertwining with displacement, currency collapse, and political fragmentation. The escalation chain does not stop at food insecurity. Military actors now maneuver around hunger as both risk and tool. Local militias control grain silos, turning access into leverage. Reports emerge of breadlines managed by armed groups where distribution follows allegiance, not need. The Syrian army, Kurdish forces, Turkish-backed factions, and remnants of jihadist cells each recognize the strategic value of food. Starvation becomes a battlefield tactic, not an accident. In besieged areas, Bread is more powerful than bullets, and hunger wears down resistance where shelling fails. Drought-induced famine, therefore, is not a separate humanitarian story, but part of the military theater, feeding instability across the northern provinces and reshaping loyalties on the ground. The economic ripples extend far beyond wheat fields. Syria's currency, already devalued from years of sanctions and war, plunges further as food imports surge. Families spend over 60% of their income on food, leaving nothing for healthcare, education, or rebuilding. As wages collapse, more Syrians are pushed into informal economies, smuggling, black market trade, or enlistment in armed groups that at least promise rations. The collapse of agriculture also erodes one of Syria's traditional export bases, forcing deeper dependence on external aid, while neighbors like Lebanon and Jordan feel the strain as cross-border food prices rise. In global grain markets, already destabilized by disruptions in Ukraine and climate shocks in Africa, Syria's famine adds another fault line in the fragile architecture of food security. Political and diplomatic pressure builds as hunger exposes divisions. What begins as dry fields within Syria's borders does not remain contained. Drought-driven famine radiates outward, carried not only by desperate people, but by the market currents that bind the Middle East into a fragile whole. As northern Syria's grain silos stand empty, families walk toward crossings into Iraq, Jordan, and Lebanon. Some carry the remnants of a harvest stored in sacks, others only children and documents. At the global level, humanitarian agencies reallocate funds from other crises to Syria, draining resources for emergencies in Africa and Asia. Grain traders, watching instability spread in the Levant, adjust prices and hedge risks, adding volatility to already fragile markets. What begins as one nation's drought becomes a factor in the global food system's instability, driving further speculation and amplifying insecurity far from the Middle East. Political and diplomatic pressures converge in a complex knot. The United Nations warns of famine, but faces paralysis in the Security Council, where disagreements over aid delivery through Turkey versus Damascus block consensus. Russia insists that aid must flow through Syrian government channels, using its veto power to restrict cross-border lifelines. Western governments demand accountability and access, but their own sanctions complicate relief. Turkey presses Europe for additional financial support, warning that it cannot absorb another surge of Syrians. Lebanon pleads for international assistance to stabilize refugee camps, but donors hesitate amid corruption scandals. Meanwhile, Gulf states offer limited bilateral aid, often conditioned on political concessions. Hunger becomes another battleground in diplomacy, where competing interests overshadow humanitarian urgency. The open-ended trajectory is sobering. The Syrian drought is not a single-season anomaly, but part of a multi-year trend linked to global climate patterns. Forecasts suggest further declines in precipitation and rising temperatures across the Fertile Crescent. Even if military violence were to subside, environmental stress guarantees continued displacement, economic collapse, and political fragility. The region faces a dilemma without precedent: how to manage not just the aftermath of war, but the permanence of a new climate reality. Will borders hold under the pressure of millions seeking food and water? Will governments adapt with new agricultural strategies, or will they collapse under the combined weight of war and climate? Will external powers intervene for stability or exploit the crisis for leverage? The answers remain suspended, unresolved, as drought continues to deepen and hunger extends beyond war's immediate battlefield. This part of the crisis narrative closes not with solutions, but with questions sharpened by urgency. The Levant's fate now hinges on whether a region fractured by politics can recognize climate as the common adversary. If not, famine will not only claim lives but redraw the map of populations, economies, and alliances. What began in Syria's dry fields may yet become the template of crises to come. Wars ignited not only by ideology or territory, but by the absence of rain and the silence of empty rivers. Alongside the human movement flows economic pressure: higher bread prices in Tripoli, thinner flour stocks in Amman, queues outside bakeries in southern Turkey. The absence of Syrian wheat is not an isolated national tragedy. It is a fracture spreading across an already unstable region. Events accumulate with an almost mechanical inevitability. The Syrian refugee population, already the world's largest, expands once more. Camps in Lebanon that were designed for tens of thousands now hold hundreds of thousands. In Jordan's Zaatari camp, tents are repurposed for new arrivals who left villages when crops failed for the third consecutive season. Turkey, bearing the strain of over 3.6 million Syrian refugees, faces renewed domestic backlash as food prices rise and rural Syrians cross its border not as war casualties, but as climate migrants. Each movement magnifies political friction, inflaming nationalist rhetoric and testing governments that are themselves burdened by inflation and resource scarcity. Hunger erases the distinction between war refugee and climate refugee. Both become symbols of a crisis that transcends categories. Systemic vulnerability deepens at the regional level. The Levant has long been interdependent for food and water, but climate extremes undermine these balances. Lebanon, once importing affordable wheat through Syrian ports, now struggles with supply bottlenecks. Iraq, reliant on Euphrates flows from upstream Syria and Turkey, watches its own southern marshes dry further, tightening tensions over transboundary water rights. Jordan, with among the lowest per capita water supplies in the world, faces intensified strain as Syrian farmers and herders move south. These systemic weaknesses magnify the drought's effect, turning it from a localized disaster into a regional destabilizer. The crisis demonstrates that environmental shocks do not respect borders, and that governance gaps in one country cascade across its neighbors. Military dynamics respond predictably. Control of migration routes becomes as strategic as control of front lines. Turkish patrols along the border tighten restrictions, yet smugglers adapt, guiding families through riverbeds and mountain passes. Kurdish forces in northeastern Syria weigh how to manage inflows of displaced rural populations, calculating whether to integrate them or treat them as potential liabilities. Within Syria itself, famine-prone zones are contested with a different logic. Whoever provides bread can claim legitimacy. Militias transform humanitarian corridors into economic assets, taxing convoys and diverting aid. International military coalitions focused on counterterrorism are forced to acknowledge that drought-driven desperation creates recruitment pools for extremist cells. Hunger not only weakens communities, it reshapes security landscapes. The economic ripple accelerates across multiple levels. In Damascus, families survive by selling furniture, jewelry, or even door frames for bread. Black market networks thrive, importing flour at inflated prices and distributing it through shadow economies linked to political patrons. In Beirut, bread riots erupt after another spike in flour costs, inflaming a country already paralyzed by financial collapse. In Istanbul and Ankara, inflation protests link food insecurity to broader discontent over refugees. The Syrian drought no longer appears as a local affliction, but as one fragment in a wider pattern of systemic disruption where climate extremes intersect with fragile supply chains. Hunger within Syria links to hunger beyond, and its drivers mirror those now straining other geographies. For nations dependent on imports, including much of the Middle East and North Africa, this volatility translates directly into domestic unrest. Subsidy systems buckle as governments cannot sustain artificially low bread prices against rising world costs. Egypt, the world's largest wheat importer, watches Syria's famine with unease, recognizing its own vulnerability should supply chains tighten further. In Europe, policymakers confront secondary effects, rising food prices combined with energy shocks, fueling inflation that erodes household budgets and amplifies political discontent. Thus, Syria's drought becomes not only a humanitarian narrative, but a signal event in the larger cycle of global economic stress. Diplomatic pressure follows the contours of these economic strains. The United Nations attempts to coordinate a response but faces gridlock, with donor fatigue evident after multiple concurrent crises. Western powers link humanitarian pledges to political conditions in Damascus, while Russia and Iran leverage food access to solidify influence. Turkey pushes for broader recognition of climate-induced migration as a shared European burden, but EU member states resist, wary of political backlash. The Gulf states weigh humanitarian donations against strategic interests, offering funds selectively to enhance regional leverage. Syria's famine thereby becomes a bargaining chip across multiple negotiating tables, from Geneva to Brussels to Moscow. Each shipment of wheat or tanker of fuel is entwined with diplomatic trade-offs, where human survival competes with geopolitical calculation. The open-ended dimension grows sharper. Climate models suggest that the drought conditions gripping Syria are not temporary anomalies, but harbingers of a new normal. Rainfall is projected to decline further, while demand for water rises with population growth and industrial needs. The global food system, already stressed, cannot absorb continuous shocks without further dislocations. Syria illustrates the trajectory. A fragile state, unable to withstand climate volatility, collapses into famine, triggering migration, regional instability, economic disruption, and geopolitical maneuvering. The unresolved question is whether the world can adapt its systems in time. Will new agricultural technologies, alternative trade corridors, or reformed humanitarian frameworks emerge before the chain of crises accelerates further? Or will Syria's famine become one case among many, a precursor to a century defined by hunger as the silent consequence of both war and climate? The analysis closes with recognition of systemic fragility without resolution. Syria's famine, born from drought, transcends national boundaries and illustrates the convergence of climate, conflict, and global market vulnerability. What began as failed rains in the Euphrates Valley now reverberates through bread prices in Cairo, policy debates in Brussels, and naval deployments in the Mediterranean. Hunger, once assumed to be a humanitarian issue managed by aid, proves instead to be a driver of instability at multiple levels. The conclusion remains open. The crisis continues, its trajectory uncertain, its implications vague. The silence of Syria's empty rivers echoes far beyond its borders, into the corridors of international diplomacy and the kitchens of households across continents. The Fertile Crescent, once mythologized as the birthplace of agriculture, becomes instead a case study in agricultural collapse under combined pressure, rising temperatures, dwindling rivers, and political fragmentation. What unfolds there is not isolated, but reflective of a global trend in which food insecurity escalates faster than humanitarian systems can respond. The immediate event descriptions expand beyond Syrian borders. Grain silos in Hasakah stand empty, while global news outlets simultaneously report crop losses in India, Argentina, and the Horn of Africa. Wheat shipments once flowing from Ukraine are disrupted by war in the Black Sea, rerouting global trade and driving up costs. The drought in Syria therefore collides with external shocks. Even if Damascus could import food, the price of grain has surged on world markets, magnifying domestic collapse. Refugees leaving Syria find no relief in Lebanon, Jordan, or Turkey, where inflation has already strained food access. Across the Mediterranean, in North Africa, bread protests echo the same desperation. The Syrian crisis, though rooted in local drought, is inseparable from this planetary food emergency. At the systemic level, vulnerabilities of global food architecture are exposed. Modern agriculture depends on predictable climate, cheap energy, and open trade, but each of these assumptions has eroded. The climate system delivers more frequent extremes, heat waves, floods, prolonged droughts. Energy markets, destabilized by geopolitical confrontation, raise fertilizer and transport costs. Trade corridors, vulnerable to conflict, sanctions, and blockades, fracture under pressure. Syria's famine illustrates how these vulnerabilities combine when climate cuts supply, when war cuts logistics, when sanctions cut financial access, no buffer remains. International aid agencies that once counted on surplus production from exporting states now face scarcities themselves, INEAs, and each allocation to Syria means one less shipment for Yemen, Somalia, or Afghanistan. Systemic fragility magnifies each local crisis into a shared global burden. Military escalations adapt to this wider landscape. Armed groups within Syria recognize that famine aligns with broader food disruptions and use the narrative of hunger to recruit. Propaganda highlights empty breadlines as evidence of abandonment by international institutions. Extremist cells exploit this desperation, portraying themselves as providers of aid, however limited, in exchange for allegiance. Meanwhile, state militaries outside Syria calculate the risk of instability spilling across borders. Turkish forces deploy additional patrols along migration routes, citing food-driven displacement as a security threat. In the eastern Mediterranean, naval units monitor shipping corridors as aid vessels and commercial traders compete for priority passage. Hunger, once viewed as a humanitarian problem, becomes a parameter in military planning, influencing patrol routes, deployment priorities, and alliance calculations. The economic ripples expand into the architecture of global trade. Wheat futures in Chicago and Paris spike with every new report of crop failure or blocked shipment. Investors hedge against instability, driving prices further upward. The Syrian famine does not unfold in isolation, but within the gravitational pull of great power rivalry. Food insecurity, once viewed as a humanitarian challenge, is now entangled in strategic competition among global actors. The drought in the Fertile Crescent intersects with a larger confrontation where Russia, the United States, the European Union, and regional powers each position themselves around aid, trade, and influence. For ordinary Syrians, these macroeconomic rivalries translate into daily scarcity, where bread is scarce, not only because of failed crops, but because of competing sanctions, subsidies, and blockades. The crisis becomes a laboratory of how global economic competition plays out in the households of vulnerable populations. Diplomatic pressure mounts with each escalation cycle. Russia frames its involvement as a defense of sovereignty, accusing Western powers of weaponizing sanctions to starve Syria. The US and EU counter with accusations that Moscow exploits hunger as leverage, pointing to its vetoes in the Security Council. Turkey positions itself as indispensable, controlling a critical humanitarian lifeline through its border and demanding financial support from Europe in exchange for managing refugees. Gulf states offer to finance selective relief operations but insist on visibility and political credit. The United Nations issues repeated warnings of famine, but its resolutions are diluted by veto politics and conditional compromises. Diplomacy becomes a theater where humanitarian urgency is staged but rarely resolved, subordinated to the calculus of power. The open-ended conclusion reflects the depth of entanglement. Syria's drought-driven famine is not likely to be resolved by rainfall alone, nor by a sudden ceasefire in ongoing conflicts. It is embedded in global rivalries that ensure humanitarian relief is partial, conditional, and temporary. The trajectory remains uncertain. Will external actors stabilize Syria's food supply as part of broader negotiations, or will they allow hunger to persist as leverage? Will climate adaptation strategies emerge, or will continued drought magnify dependence on great powers? The answers remain elusive, as each actor measures gains and losses not in lives saved but in strategic influence accrued. What is certain is that the Syrian famine is no longer a crisis confined to its fields and villages. It is a pressure point in global politics, a demonstration of how the convergence of climate, conflict, and great power rivalry leaves ordinary people suspended between survival and collapse. Hunger becomes both a byproduct of climate extremes and a lever in geopolitical maneuvering. The event description sharpens around the manipulation of supply corridors. In the Northwest, the United Nations had relied on cross-border deliveries through Turkey to reach millions in Idlib and Aleppo. Russia, backing Damascus, insists that aid must be routed through the Syrian government, using its veto power in the UN Security Council to limit alternative channels. This transforms relief operations into bargaining sessions. The continuation of cross-border convoys depends not on humanitarian need but on negotiations between Moscow and Western capitals. Every renewal of the mandate is temporary, every shipment conditional. In northeastern Syria, where Kurdish authorities administer territory, aid flows face restrictions linked to Turkey's opposition, while U.S. forces maintain a limited presence to secure both counterterrorism objectives and humanitarian access. Thus, food delivery is shaped less by rainfall or crop cycles than by military deployments and diplomatic standoffs. Systemic vulnerability is revealed in the reliance on external powers for Syria's survival. Domestic agricultural collapse forces dependence on imports and aid, but those flows are controlled by actors with broader agendas. Russia leverages its grain exports and its influence in Damascus as bargaining chips in negotiations with Europe and the United States. The U.S. uses sanctions as a pressure point, targeting Syria's financial system while offering selective waivers for humanitarian trade. The European Union ties reconstruction funding to political reforms, limiting resources that could otherwise stabilize food systems. Regional states, from Iran to the Gulf monarchies, provide bilateral assistance calibrated to their own influence strategies. The result is a system where humanitarian relief is structurally subordinated to geopolitical interests, leaving Syria's population vulnerable to shifts in external relations. Military escalation follows these political maneuvers. Russian troops stationed in Syria protect supply routes tied to Damascus, while also signaling Moscow's capacity to control humanitarian access. U.S. forces in the northeast emphasize stabilization missions, but their presence serves a dual role, countering ISIS remnants and securing corridors for aid. Turkish military operations along the northern border complicate access further, as Ankara links refugee management and food assistance to its campaigns against Kurdish groups. The famine landscape is therefore militarized. Silos, bakeries, and border crossings are treated as assets in ongoing conflicts. Food security becomes a contested resource, guarded by soldiers and contested by militias, where each delivery carries strategic weight. The economic ripple intensifies under this great power overlay. Russia's war in Ukraine disrupts global grain markets, narrowing supply options for import-dependent countries like Syria. Moscow offers grain shipments to Damascus at discounted rates, portraying itself as a benefactor, yet simultaneously limits UN convoys to opposition-held regions. The US and EU, by contrast, provide funding through humanitarian agencies, but avoid direct engagement with Syrian state structures, ensuring that economic stabilization remains elusive. Sanctions complicate agricultural recovery by restricting access to fertilizers, spare parts, and financial transfers. Black markets proliferate, linked to patronage networks tied to political and military actors. The Syrian famine is not an endpoint, but a signal, a visible marker of how climate extremes and geopolitical fragmentation converge to redefine security in the 21st century. What unfolds in the Euphrates Valley foreshadows crises that will recur across multiple geographies, each layered with conflict, migration, and systemic fragility. The Syrian famine already forces international actors into difficult choices: how to balance sanctions with humanitarian need, how to allocate limited resources across multiple crises, how to manage refugee flows without destabilizing host countries. These same dilemmas will recur elsewhere. International institutions face gridlock, constrained by great power competition and donor fatigue. Regional blocs struggle to contain the secondary effects of migration and economic collapse. The Syrian case thus becomes a template of paralysis. The world acknowledges the crisis but cannot act decisively, trapped between competing interests and limited resources. Hunger becomes not only a humanitarian emergency, but a marker of geopolitical dysfunction. The open-ended conclusion is stark. Syria's famine is unlikely to end with a single intervention, a sudden influx of aid, or a favorable rainy season. It will persist, recur, and evolve, entangled with war, sanctions, and climate trends. The broader implication is that the 21st century will be shaped not only by traditional conflicts over ideology or territory, but by recurring crises where hunger, water, and displacement redefine the meaning of security. The Syrian famine, therefore, is both tragedy and warning. It shows how quickly societies unravel when environmental stress meets institutional collapse, and how those failures reverberate outward into regional and global instability. What remains unanswered is whether the world will adapt or whether Syria's fate will repeat across continents. Will states re-engineer food systems for resilience or continue to allow markets to fracture under pressure? Will global institutions overcome paralysis or remain caught in cycles of vetoes and bargaining? Will great powers view hunger as a shared threat requiring cooperation or as another front in their rivalry? Syria offers no resolution to these questions, only a mirror reflecting possible futures. The silence of its empty rivers, the dust of its barren fields, the queues outside its bakeries. These are not only images of one nation's collapse, but signals of a century entering a new phase of fragility. Hunger in Syria is hunger beyond war. It is hunger beyond borders. It is hunger as the pressure point where climate conflict and geopolitics converge. And it is hunger with no clear end in sight. The hunger spreading from Syria is not an isolated tragedy. It is a preview of how societies unravel when the natural foundation of survival, water, soil, and food, is eroded under escalating pressures. The immediate event description moves beyond Syria to the emerging arc of climate-driven instability. Across the Sahel, failed rains force herders into conflict with farmers. In South Asia, glacial melt threatens both flooding and scarcity for millions dependent on river flows. In Central America, prolonged drought propels migration northward, destabilizing borders thousands of miles away. Syria belongs to this expanding map of climate-fueled famine zones, but its war-scarred terrain amplifies the effect. The world sees in Syria a concentrated demonstration of what happens when governance collapse, military conflict, and climate volatility intersect. Hunger there cannot be dismissed as a local misfortune. It is a harbinger of systemic breakdown. The systemic vulnerabilities highlighted by Syria are global in scope. Modern supply chains operate on assumptions of stability, predictable harvests, functioning markets, secure transport. Yet the Syrian drought shows how quickly these assumptions fail when climate shocks coincide with political weakness. In wealthy states, resilience mechanisms absorb part of the pressure, but even they feel strain when prices spike. In fragile states, the buffers collapse entirely, transforming climate events into existential threats. The systemic flaw is not only in agriculture, but in governance and coordination. The international system lacks mechanisms to respond to simultaneous, cross-regional hunger crises without exhausting resources or triggering geopolitical competition. Syria demonstrates the gap between humanitarian ideals and institutional capacity, exposing the fragility of a system built for isolated emergencies rather than global-scale stress. Military escalation remains central in this broader landscape. As water and food grow scarcer, armed actors everywhere recalibrate strategies. National militaries deploy to secure river basins, border checkpoints, and supply convoys. Non-state groups exploit hunger to recruit and to control territory. In Syria, this dynamic has already matured. Bread distribution is a weapon of war. Elsewhere, the pattern begins to replicate. In the Horn of Africa, militias control food corridors. In Latin America, organized crime exploits shortages to tighten control over rural populations. Syria is a concentrated example, but its lessons are transferable. Hunger is not incidental to conflict, but embedded within it, both as driver and as instrument. The economic ripples illustrate how fragile global markets are when tested by cascading shocks. Syria's famine coincides with war in Ukraine, drought in South America, and export restrictions in Asia. Each event compounds the next, amplifying scarcity and price volatility. Global grain reserves, once seen as sufficient, prove inadequate when multiple failures coincide. For households in wealthy countries, this means higher food bills and inflation. For households in fragile states, it means hunger and collapse. The Syrian example shows how quickly domestic scarcity translates into cross-border instability, refugee flows, and regional economic disruption. In a globally connected system, there is no such thing as an isolated famine. Political and diplomatic pressure mounts as these economic strains deepen.